leading the interview and the conversation, and we're super excited today to have Amy Mason on. She is an access technology specialist from the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco, but I believe that she is a homegrown girl and is back for the holidays. But I bet it looks like they're all settled in. You will learn more about her here on Community Conversations. Over to you, Ryan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to another edition of Community Conversations. Don't adjust your radios. I know that you're used to hearing the lovely voice of Jay Nielsen, but she is conducting a tour, surprise, surprise, as we speak. So I'm going to pinch hit for her today. We are very excited to have with us in the studio, as Becca just announced, Amy Mason. Perhaps you'll recognize her voice, if not her name. She is a native Nebraskan, grew up in the town of Cedar Bluff. Was it not, Amy?
Cedar Bluffs, that's
Cedar
right.
Bluffs, okay. And she's been all over. She lived in Lincoln for a while. She's been in Baltimore. Now she's in San Francisco. So she is a very well-traveled person. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here. And first of all, I want to explain that the genesis of this interview. Amy was supposed to be my special guest on an interview that would have resulted in a couple of episodes of Tech It Out, which is our Friday afternoon tech show. And due to circumstances beyond my control, some things happened, and Amy agreed to be our last-minute guest for Community Conversations. Things just get a little crazy at the end of the year when you have crazy weather and people getting sick and people going on vacation and recovering from the holidays. And so we apologize if things seems a little discombobulated here, but Amy has rolled with us and we're excited. Amy, before we start, as Jane always says, before we get into the meat of our discussion, Jane always says that we are guests in the homes, the living rooms of our listeners. So pretend like you're a guest in someone's living room and tell us all about Amy Mason, about your background and what led you to this moment where you're here talking to us right now.
Absolutely. I grew up, as Ryan mentioned, in Cedar Bluffs, Nebraska. I've been legally blind-ish all my life. Lost a bunch of vision when I was 17, and so I started learning Braille at that point, and I wanted to be a counselor, went and got a degree that didn't work out, realized I didn't want to be a counselor.
When you say a counselor, what kind of a counselor?
A therapist.
Therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I only clarify that because in the blindness field, when you hear the word counselor, it might very well mean a therapist. It also might mean a voc rehab counselor. That is often what we hear when we say counselors. So that's why I'm clarifying. But go ahead.
Absolutely. So I kicked around a bit, found my way into a couple of forgettable jobs, and at least I'm still trying.
I get that. Vending, right?
Yeah, that was one of the two.
Amy and I both have been in the vending program, so I know exactly what she's talking about by forgettable jobs.
And went to get a computer networking degree. Found that I was not getting hired to do computer networking and went to visit Maryland with a friend, did a summer program where I was teaching tech to kids and realized I really loved it. Was offered a job with the NFB where I was an access technology specialist for the last 7 years, from 2011 through 2018. And right near the end of that, fell in love with the idea of writing training materials for helping folks be more comfortable with the technology in their lives, and was offered a job with the San Francisco Lighthouse, which promised me the opportunity to do more one-on-one training with folks, more group trainings, which seemed to me like an awfully good place to start for that whole curriculum building endeavor that I wanted to embark on.
We'll get to the Lighthouse here in a bit, but I want to ask you, you mentioned you lost a bunch of your vision when you were, was it 18?
17.
17, okay. So you were essentially raised as a sighted person.
Yes.
For the most part.
Yeah.
What was life like growing up in small-town Nebraska, even with a visual deficit, we'll call it?
It was It was a experience that I'm glad that I had. I found that because I didn't have the vision to actually learn to drive when I was 16, it was a little bit isolated. Because we were actually outside of town, so I couldn't even walk up the street to buy a soda or whatever.
Oh, yeah, I get it. I grew up in Kearney, and I grew up in a residential area, so not driving was definitely isolating.
Yeah.
Not quite as isolated as probably like a small town or a rural area as you were, but close.
Yeah. So, I mean, I certainly enjoyed. There were some wonderful things, like being able to really see the moon, and I couldn't usually see the stars, but just being able to see the sky so much more clearly than any place less rural. Just the color of the night sky and the sounds of rural America are just wonderful.
They are indeed.
Crickets and even the dogs. And
you got, so you came to Lincoln. I want to say you went through the Orientation Center for the Blind. Did you not?
I did. It was a bit of a truncated trip because I had a full scholarship for the first year of college, which I took advantage of, but to do that I had to go immediately the semester after high school, so I only did a few months there. I'd gotten a lot of my foundation, though, honestly, through the Commission's program Wages, Work and Gain Experience in the Summer, where we had summer jobs, lived in the dorms in Lincoln at the university, and most importantly had several blind counselors and role models who were keeping track of us and keeping us more or less out of too much danger while still giving us the freedom to really explore the downtown area and the campus. And
would you say that was your first real kind of experience of independence as a person who was losing their vision?
Yeah, I think I would. It wasn't my first experience of blindness per se, which would have been my aunt, Nancy Oltman, who's in Hastings to this day. Great aunt, actually.
She bakes a great cake.
But it was my first opportunity to really experience independent living, and really to get to know blind and visually impaired folks, low vision folks who were right around my age or college age, someone to look up to and learn both good habits and really kind of just believe in. So my counselors and their friends that summer who snuck in occasionally to visit us.
Great.
Were absolutely role models, and still love them all to this day.
Now, you said that you went from your desired vocational goal was to be a counselor, and then your experience in Baltimore kind of changed your focus to technology. Tell me a little bit more about that time and what it was like moving to – I mean, certainly you went from small-town Nebraska to eventually I know you lived in Lincoln for a while, and I think you also lived in Des Moines and in Omaha. You bounced around a little bit with different jobs. But you wound up in Baltimore. What was that transition like for you, going to a big city like Baltimore?
Well, I actually slid kind of right into it much more easily than I had expected. I will say that I was the littlest bit terrified the first day that I arrived. I had to do a lot of my planning for the move from Lincoln. And so I rented an apartment sight unseen and literally flew to Baltimore with 2 suitcases and a cat. And my family was following behind with a bunch of the other stuff that I owned. and I'd never seen the place. It was kind of rainy and...
Rainy in Baltimore? I can't imagine.
It was shortly after, I don't remember which hurricane, but shortly after a hurricane, about 2 weeks after the earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
Within my first week there, I kind of got stuck down by work one night because a building collapsed and all the buses were rerouted. So that was exciting.
That was exciting. And you did that job how long?
7 years.
So you were let's see, your title is the same in both jobs. You were an access technology specialist for the National Federation of the Blind and their main headquarters in Baltimore for 7 years. So we want to establish your bona fides because we're going to focus on technology and accessibility in particular for a lot of this interview. But I want our listeners to understand that you're a very credible person. So tell me about some of your job duties and what you did while you were in Baltimore.
Absolutely. While I was in Baltimore, I was focused on technology reviews and assessment. Did a lot of accessibility testing of websites particularly, but also some kiosks. Got to help out looking at some accessibility work that was being done in cabs at the time.
Tell our listeners what cabs is.
Cabs is
taxi cabs.
Taxi
Gotcha.
cab kiosks in the back seats.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And also, my first major work there was writing an article about how ebooks, which ebook options were accessible at the time. And that was all the way back in 2011. I don't think a single piece of that article is still correct, except for the fact that PDF still could be accessible and usually isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else has changed completely.
That's just the nature of the rapidly changing face of technology, really from day to day, if not from week to week. Mm-hmm. So it tells you how quick the times change. And you've talked about your writing. You mentioned it before. You have done a lot of writing, especially for the NFB. Is that still available if people wanted to go find it?
Absolutely. I would say that my biggest projects are all available in the Braille Monitor, which is available online at nfb.org. I would recommend actually Googling Driving Blind on the Information Superhighway.
That is a great article. That was the first one I thought of when I was pulling up questions for this interview.
There's actually 6 of them in total. But it starts in January of 2018 with kind of the new and improved rules of the road. And then there's one on browsers, one on screen readers, 2 different ones on active and passive browsing. Essentially, are you interacting with the website or just reading it? And then there's a little bit of a wrap-up, and I am actually in process of preparing a, shall we say, season 2 for the series, where I still want to talk about web security and what has changed and social media, a few other things like that that are still more complex, more unique topics.
Well, let me dig into the meat of it with you here, because accessibility, let me start out with this premise, and you respond to it and tell me if you think that I'm right or wrong or somewhere in the middle. I think that accessibility, and I'm talking about digital accessibility, whether it's internet, touch screens, anything like that, I think that that is our battleground of the 21st century for blind people. That is to say, that is where we need to wage our push for equality first and foremost. Would you agree with that?
I think we need a 2-pronged strategy, and that is one of those prongs. The other is still literacy, proper Braille, large print, being able to especially Braille, because so often large print, I can tell you over and over again, for me, has just been unreliable. But yeah, otherwise, electronic accessibility is where it's going to happen to bring us full circle, and in fact will help, I think, with Braille, because increasingly it's actually easier and easier to get your hands on electronic Braille. And,
okay.
Yeah.
Now, for our listeners, because perhaps some of them aren't as familiar with some of the tech terms as others, define as best you can accessibility for us as we're talking about it today.
Absolutely. I described accessibility in the past as a technology is accessible if you can use it as easily, as efficiently as your peers who are not disabled. And there's, in my mind, a few different components to that. Functional accessibility is what I would like to call the gold standard, and these are my terms, not necessarily official, but
Sure.
they work. Functional accessibility is when that is as good for you as it is for everybody else, and kind of my gold standard. But there's also another term that one has to a little bit understand, and that's technical accessibility. That is the kind of accessibility that gets involved in some of the legal cases you might have heard about, things like Target, things like Expedia, some of the colleges that have been brought up on lawsuits. Most recently, I know that Domino's was sued, the pizza company.
That's right, and I believe, I won't say that they've lost because they'll probably take it to the Supreme Court, but the latest ruling went against them.
Supreme Court actually turned it back.
Oh, they
said they aren't touching it.
So they did lose.
Yep.
Okay. And just for our listeners, give us a really quick thumbnail of what the Domino's case was about. Domino's Pizza.
Well, I wasn't actively involved in that one, but my understanding is that there was a blind gentleman who was unable to order through either the Domino's app or website, and he tried to work with them. They refused, so he brought a case demanding that it be accessible. And the judge agreed that the Americans with Disabilities Act should, in fact, cover websites like Domino's. Domino's was trying to say that it did not. The judge disagreed. So now they are having to make this site accessible. The frustrating thing about the Domino's case is that accessibility on that technical front, as we were talking about, doesn't need to be all that difficult. It involves making changes that generally will make a website much stronger, easier to update, more robust, and truly a better experience for everyone, not just people with disabilities.
Right. So ordering a pizza is very much different in 2019 than it was when I was growing up in 1987 or even 1997. It used to be that you would pick up the phone and you would call Domino's and say, I want to order a large pepperoni and a 2-liter of Coke. And, then you'd get either pay cash or give them your credit card, maybe write them a check, and they'd be there in 30 minutes or less. And now you can go onto the internet, you can go onto your iPhone, you can open an app that's specially made for Domino's. Very few people probably call anymore. And so this is the crux of what we're talking about in the changing face of technology. Wouldn't you agree that the evolution of digital technology has really transformed everything in the way people do things in their basic daily lives?
Absolutely. I think that we have the potential with technology to have so much more access to information than we have had in previous generations. So many books are available electronically, so many magazines. They give us a lot more freedom. And we're able to catch a lot of our own mail before it ever gets to us in digital form. You can visit the bank and find out what your balance is without making a call or making a trip across town. You can pay so many of your bills, find a lot of useful information. So, yeah, absolutely. The problem is that it's still a challenge to help developers and creators remember that everyone exists and not just 20-somethings with perfectly functional hands and eyes and ears. And
Sure. Able-bodied people, quote-unquote.
Yep.
We'll get to the developers in just a moment, but you referenced something I want to touch on. You said Domino's wasn't one of the cases you were involved in. So, of course, I have to ask you, what were some of the cases during your time in Baltimore that you were a part of?
I was involved in monitoring the Target case, National Federation of the Blind versus Target, and that was really the wrap-ups after they'd done some beautiful, beautiful work. Just kind of helping to verify the work as an independent third party. I was also heavily involved in helping the folks from Expedia and Travelocity to make their sites really some top-notch accessibility. It is a little more complicated than might be expected for someone who has been using a screen reader for a long time but not learned some of the newer technologies. But it is very accessible and very much worth exploring. They've done a beautiful job. And it was kind of an honor to get to work with them.
Right. So the Target one is interesting to me only because Target is, first of all, we just got through Christmas, but Target is everywhere. Everyone knows what Target is. Perhaps people might not have used Travelocity or whatnot, or Expedia, but they've definitely at least heard of Target. Were the basis of that case kind of the same as Domino's inaccessibility with their website and their app?
Yes, it was. I believe that it certainly at the beginning predated my time at the Federation. But it was not possible for blind users at the time to check out using the shopping cart feature on the website. And it was a pretty landmark case in that it was when the judicial system began to establish the idea that a store with a brick-and-mortar location also had to be accessible in their online presence.
Interesting. And I have to say that I've browsed Target. I haven't purchased anything through the app, but I have browsed them, and they're very easy to use, at least navigationally. So
yeah,
they really did their job well on that. Why, in your opinion, based on your own experiences, why do you think that developers and entrepreneurs resist accessibility so much?
For the most part, I don't know that it's resistance so much as a lack of awareness. They don't think about the fact that people with disabilities, blind people, use computers, use any piece of technology. And so, honestly, you'll see a lot of problems even that will just affect folks who are less technology savvy because they aren't thinking about people for whom the iconography of the web is natural. Folks who come to computers in their 50s, 60s, 70s certainly can learn any of this, but they're starting from a lot further back because there are things like the menu being 3 horizontal bars at the top of a web page. What does that actually mean to anyone until you understand what that's supposed to be? It's actually nicknamed in developer circles as a hamburger menu because it kind of looks like a hamburger.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. I love the food reference, especially about this time of day. So,
but that doesn't mean that it means anything to someone who's never really encountered it. Or if you've used a smartphone and look at what they call the sharing icon, where you might be sending an email or a text message to someone else with information. That's a square with an arrow pointed vertically up out of it. And I'll tell you what, the first time that I encountered that, until I was able to use VoiceOver to discover that it was the share icon, I was real confused. And that's
so the share icon's kind of universal across different pages and such.
Mostly.
Okay.
YouTube has decided instead they're using an arrow that kind of points. It starts going vertically and then points off to the right.
Of course, because it's YouTube and they got to be different.
Right.
So, well, and many businesses will probably follow that model eventually. But so you think that ignorance or lack of awareness is the basic reason why we encounter such difficulty in finding more accessibility?
Yeah.
And yet, when the NFB does go in and tries to establish a dialogue with these different entrepreneurs, these companies, they still encounter resistance. In other words, we wouldn't be going to court if it were just a matter of dialoguing and raising awareness and working together. How does it go from point A to point Z like that?
Well, to be honest, the cases are the public stuff that you hear about. But there's been a lot of work that's been done with companies before it ever got that far. There's a company, for example, that helps to send secure email attachments, and honestly, I wish I could remember the name of the company now. Mm-hmm. And when they heard what they needed to do to make those more accessible, they were thrilled to work with us. And they were
proactive.
There. Yes.
Interesting.
And very much in the same way, there's a group out of Canada. I wish with all my heart I could remember. But they actually are actively working to make PowerPoints more accessible. And Microsoft is one that finally came around of their own accord. If any of you are using Windows 10, you might find Narrator is enough to keep you going, and even if it's not entirely enough, you might find it's easier and better than JAWS or NVDA when you're working in certain Microsoft and Windows Store style applications, which we could talk about if you want or not.
Sure, go ahead. Jump off on that springboard if you wish.
Sure. Windows 10 is the most recent version of Windows, and Microsoft has been putting in a lot of effort to improve its accessibility for all users. They've done some beautiful work with offering dark themes, which for me is very, very important. I find it really uncomfortable to deal with the white screen with black text, which has been traditional for so many years. And Microsoft's helping to make the dark screen with white text just one of the options available to everybody. They've been doing things to help folks be a little more comfortable with text-to-speech. They have their own magnifier. It isn't quite as robust as some of the professional products like Zoom Text. But if what you need is basic magnification, it's right there. And the same with Narrator. And they've been improving that a lot. Back in the days of Windows 7 and before, it was completely unusable.
Yeah.
For anything more than maybe getting your computer shut down and restarted.
Well, I just like the idea of it from the competition perspective, that there's more than one option out there. Back when I was growing up, it was always JAWS, and only JAWS. And either you used it or nothing. I mean, unless you wanted to go with a really cheap one. And now you've got NVDA and you've got Narrator, it sounds like, and a host of options.
Yeah, for screen reading on Windows, you're looking mostly at NVDA, JAWS, and Narrator. On the Mac, you've really only got VoiceOver.
VoiceOver, yeah. But of course, they build it in; it's integral to it. So, before we go, because I know you want to talk about structured discovery, but before we do that, I talked to your contemporaries recently, and I asked them what I call popcorn ball questions. These are fun, harmless questions designed to make you think. And so I asked them, and I'll ask you, technology-wise, what is the coolest piece of fictional technology that doesn't exist? And I'm talking like fictional from a fictional universe like Star Trek or Harry Potter. Harry Potter wouldn't count. But in your opinion, what's the coolest thing that has yet to be invented that's fictional?
Transporter disapparation.
Okay. That was pretty predictable. I believe both Wes and Joe said the same thing. At the top of the list was transporter. So,
I mean, replicators are cool too, but end of the day, I have friends in Baltimore. I have friends in San Francisco. I have friends and family here in the Midwest, both Iowa and Nebraska. And being able to see everybody more often is...
Absolutely. The whole issue of cars and autonomous cars or in the environment, all that would be rendered academic if we could just get transporters up and running. So, 200 years from now, it's something to look forward to. All right. Well, it's surprising how fast time flies because we are coming toward the end of our time. We've got a few minutes left, and I want you to talk about, because I know you're passionate about it, the concept of structured discovery as it applies to technology. So let's break it down. Tell us what structured discovery is first.
Structured discovery is a teaching philosophy used in blindness training that is primarily referred to for mobility. It's one that was kind of created by some of the earlier iterations of NFB-style centers. And what they do is they are teaching the process of problem solving as opposed to teaching specific routes and specific tool sets. And so if you were traveling, they might teach you to learn the address system in your town and where you might find directions for getting from point A to point B, instead of saying, all right, you walk up the street 3 blocks, turn left, walk 4 blocks, and it'll be on your left. Of course, this is sometimes a more challenging path forward, but it also gives you a lot more freedom. You've got the ability to work around construction and difficulties. And I very much want to help bring that into teaching technology, because I feel like so much of what we've done in the past has been, all right, to access your email, you press the start button, arrow down to Outlook, hit enter. And I know that there have been some folks who have gone as far as arrow down 4 times and hit enter 3 times. And I don't want to tie somebody to technology that will change. Increasingly, it's going so fast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how I'm working on a system now that's more or less obsolete, and it was at its prime just a couple of years ago. So what would this look like in an educational setting if it were to become a reality?
Sure. It would be a matter of going a little bit back to the basics, giving you maybe the kind of education that I had in my early computer networking, where you start to think about how computers work, because if you're able to pull those building blocks together, you're able to work around what's happening. For instance, when you think about using the computer, you are able much more quickly to learn multiple screen readers and magnification products if you think about what you're doing in the form of not the keystrokes performing that action, but instead what you are doing with the computer. So you are interacting with it, you are communicating your desire to it. And so you learn the keystroke to do the thing, but you are much more focused on the concept and not the physical act. The way I like to describe it is that a computer is no more intelligent than a toaster. And in fact, your interactions with a computer are very similar to your interactions with a toaster. When you come up to the toaster with your piece of bread in hand, that's very much like coming to the computer with a piece of data. You have a file that you wish to email. So you set your bread into the toaster. You point the computer at the email you want to send, and then you put in the parameters that you need to make things happen. In the toaster, that's setting the slider to medium dark and making sure that it's plugged in. And on the computer, it is...
I'm laughing at your... because, of course, it takes you back to the whole tech support. Are you sure it's plugged in?
Yeah, absolutely. Since your computer's already talking, we're going to assume that it is plugged in or doesn't need to be at the moment.
Sure.
But yes, absolutely. You would go in any number of ways and access the command to tell the computer, I want to send this as an attachment in email. And so then the computer has a couple of extra steps, but it's no more complex than what you're doing with the toaster. The computer then says, okay, I need to know things. Instead of how dark do you want your toast, I need to know where are you sending this? And who are you sending it to, essentially. So you enter the email address of the person you're sending this thing to. You're putting in other information that's needed. And the computer's like, great, I got it. And the toaster's like, okay, I'm ready. So you press down the lever, you hit send on the computer, give it a few minutes, and you have toast, and your friend has that great document that you've been writing up, that recipe for homemade soup. And so what you've done there is no more difficult. It's simply a matter of giving messages to the machine in a way that the machine understands. So what you're learning there is a little bit of the machine's language so that you can translate to it what you need to do.
Is this method that you're discussing something you're working with at the Lighthouse in San Francisco now?
Yes. I am using every tool at my disposal, actually. I have taken to using a chessboard to help explain what the computer, or the phone, I should say, is doing as you perform different commands. If you are using a smartphone and swipe right with one finger on, say, an iPhone, you are moving the voiceover cursor to the next item to the right. Mm-hmm. And so in order to help people understand and put together what we're doing, I actually have a chessboard and a little fake voiceover focus. I have them perform the command, and I show them on the chessboard essentially how that has moved things.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you find, by and large, people grasp that?
Depends on the person. For some people, it's really helpful, and for others, less so. But there is certainly a subset of the folks that I work with for whom that really clarifies the situation and helps us move along a lot faster.
Great. Amy, we're almost to the end of our time. Again, it flies when you're having fun, but we talked about your time in Baltimore, but we haven't said much about the San Francisco Lighthouse for the Blind. Do you want to give them a plug real quick and tell us a little about your work there? I
would love to. At San Francisco Lighthouse, I teach technology primarily to, all comers, but primarily adults who are mostly seniors, though some working age folks. I teach everything from iPhone and Android to JAWS and magnification. And we have other training opportunities for folks. But that's not all we do. And there are definitely things that even here in Nebraska you guys can get your hands on and really enjoy and make use of that are lighthouse specials, as they might say. We now have a website for our store, adaptations.org, I believe, is the site. The Lighthouse also has its own department that works on creating accessible media, tactile graphics, and braille signage. They will do transcription services, so if you ever need something like that that's not available here, it's something you can certainly look into the Media and Design Lab. But where this comes really cool, and I just love this, if you are ever curious to get a hold of a map of your personal area that's tactile, through the store you can get what's called a T-map that's been created through the Media and Accessible Design Lab. And it is a braille and tactile line maps set of 3 at different magnification points to give you an understanding of your neighborhood, and you can do that with any address.
Wow, that's neat. Mm-hmm. Amy, we are up against the clock because it is our Ultimate Master, but I want to thank you so much for coming in last minute and having this conversation with us. Fascinating issue about accessibility. Thank you so much for your time today.
It was my pleasure. All I can say is keep exploring.
Will do. And our guest has been Amy Mason. She is an access specialist a technology specialist from the San Francisco Lighthouse for the Blind. This has been Community Conversations. I am your host, Ryan O., filling in for Jane today. You're listening to Radio Talking Book. Please keep tuned for a calendar coming up next. Back to Becca in the control room.